to look a little deeper into the entrapment aspect of this case. Many facets of government, not to mention Wall Street, are, of course, ready for the Occupy Wall Street movement to go away. And as Marina mentioned in her report, it's not just these so-called dirty hippie disruptors of the peace being targeted. Since 9/11, hundreds of Muslims have been targeted as well, with similar tactics, like using so-called informants, oftentimes sending them into mosques to try to forge relationships and get information. Now, this continues to go on, and quite often, there's really just a fine line between a plot being thwarted and one being orchestrated by the FBI or the CIA or whomever. Joining me now to talk about this is Sahar Aziz, Associate Professor of Law at Texas Wesleyan University. Hey there, Sahar. We heard in this report, from a former FBI informant who said he was trained to orchestrate some of these. This is standard practice. Does this surprise you?
Unfortunately, it does not. This is part of a much broader strategy that's occurred since 9/11, and it's called the preventative paradigm. And facially, it's very legitimate in that we all want to stop terrorism before it occurs. And terrorism can kill hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. The problem is how you go about implementing that preventative strategy. And so, on the one hand, what you could do and what you should do is, if there is an existing plot, you stop it. The problem here with this case and with many other cases involving Muslim defendants is the question of whether or not the government in fact created a plot that it then stopped and then advertised to the public, hey, look, we're keeping you safe, your counterterrorism dollars are in good hands and well spent, and therefore please give us more money. So, and that's a question nobody knows the answer to in some cases. In other cases, I think it's pretty clear that it's borderline entrapment. But that's really what it comes down to, is how do they implement the preventative strategy?
Absolutely. Sometimes these agent provocateurs that they use are not necessarily, the right way. I mean, in this case, they're using someone who was a criminal. This 39-year-old Sahar Aziz, who was paid nearly $6,000, had prior convictions for cocaine possession, robbery, 4 convictions for passing bad checks. I mean, is this a trustworthy source?
This is a very typical resume of an informant, particularly in the counterterrorism context. If you look at most of the cases where entrapment was an issue, or people were worried that entrapment was in fact at play, and you look at the resumes of the informants, they all usually are either have felony convictions, have some kind of immigration problem, and so they've made a deal with the government to stay in exchange for being an informant. They are under serious financial constraints or financial hardship, or they are just have very dubious credibility problems. So what you have is people who already have no credibility that are abusing the system, and because the public is willing to unquestionably accept that Muslims in particular are willing to engage in terrorism and are inherently prone to terrorism, they don't go underneath, they don't go under the surface and ask, well, who was this informant and who actually started the plot and who led the plot, as opposed to just accepting it at face value. What's interesting about this Occupy case is how the race of the defendants and the identity of the defendants is going to come into play, because these are all 5 white males, and the tendency in the United States is if they see white males engaging in a terrorist plot, such as Timothy McVeigh or the Unabomber or the like, the public tends to say, okay, this is one individual who is a bad actor, and that does not in any way shed light on how other white males or Christians are portrayed or behave. That is not the case with Muslims. So I think what's going to be interesting is how the public, whether the public is skeptical or whether it accepts it at face value that, okay, they're accused of terrorism, so they must be terrorists, and we won't question the government's motives or this dubious use of this dubious informant.
Well, a couple things about what you said, Sahar. And first of all, when this case first happened, when it first came out, it was very difficult to find anyone in the media call any of these guys terrorists, or even this a terrorist plot. And I wonder if the color of their skin may have had, something to do with that. But it's really interesting when you do see something like this. With the agency involved, whether it's the FBI or the CIA, they almost always make the case that the American people are safer now than they were before. What do you think about this argument?
Well, again, I think the devil's in the details. It depends. If this was a plot that was already had started, even if it was at the initial phases, then I think I agree that they should stop it and they should arrest them. But there's a lot of questions and reasons for concern that this informant was the one who egged them on and triggered it. Now, with regard to the law of entrapment, which is an affirmative defense, meaning that the defendant has the burden of proving that he or she was, in fact, entrapped by the government. The defendant has to show that he or she did not have a predisposition, was not already predisposed to commit a particular crime, and that the government informant essentially convinced him or her that they should engage in the criminal activity. However, if they can't prove that, but all they can prove is that the government provided the defendant with opportunity and means, then they will not win their entrapment defense. So in sum, entrapment is a very pro-prosecutor body of law, a doctrine of law, and it is structured, or its de facto status is that it is very difficult for defendants to win that defense.
Even though in a lot of these cases, the informant seems to have an incentive to try to, make the hypothesis of the government come true. I do have to say, though, in this Cleveland case, one of the accused did buy 8 bricks of C4 and also mentioned that he wanted to blow up a bank. This, if I were in law enforcement, this would be, I think, in my opinion, a good lead, good evidence to go on. What is your response to that?
Well, again, it's all a matter of timing. So if that person did that before the informant got involved, or before the informant essentially joined the conspiracy, then I do agree that this would not be entrapment, and this is essentially part of what I think is a legitimate preventive paradigm, in that the informant got involved before the plot actually came to fruition and then stopped it. The question is, was this essentially maybe a radical, ideologically radical person who sat around in the corner and expressed a lot of political dissent that was controversial, unpopular, but never really was serious or disposed to commit any violence? And then the informant came in and egged them on and essentially kind of pushed them to go out and buy the chemicals and pushed them to go out and take the act. That's where it's problematic. And I do want to note that there have been some cases in the past where there have been questions as to whether the informant, like the person, Mr. Montel in California, was actually tasked to go and egg individuals on. And coincidentally, or maybe not so much, is when they got to court, the recordings, the very initial recordings, were lost or absent. So the only recordings the government had to show in evidence were later recordings. And the key recordings in any kind of entrapment defense is the very early recording between the informant and the target, because that's when you know for sure whether that person was predisposed to commit a criminal act or not. So that has also raised suspicions among some members of the public as to the government's motives when those recordings are missing.
I think those are all really important questions. Hopefully they find the answers as they do dig a little bit deeper into this case. Sahar Aziz, Associate Professor of Law at Texas Wesleyan University. Thanks so much.
Thank you.